Morning, everyone. Charles Moskowitz here. Welcome to the program. Doing a little bit of live broadcasting in advance of my guest coming up, David, who joins me to discuss pretty much Jewish issues as they intersect with American politics and Israel. And David and I often disagree, but I've been doing a regular program with him. But in the meantime, just wanted to swing open the lines a bit and discuss a breaking story, and that is that the Supreme Court has upheld two Arizona laws that I would argue protect the voters of that state. It's being portrayed by the mainstream media as restrictive, but what it does is it allows the Arizona state legislature, and by the way, all state legislatures, according to the Constitution, are charged with this responsibility of making election laws. So this is entirely constitutional, which is why the Supreme Court supported it. And that the law basically bans the practice of voter harvesting, which is when a special interest group sends people out in advance, usually of elections or on election day, to harvest votes from perhaps nursing homes and buildings and by other means, and then they present the vote as a third party to voting places. It's a system that obviously is rife with potential corruption because you have a special interest. They're not going to, like, I don't know, during the last election, you might have a special interest decide, well, we're not going to include in our pile of votes a vote for either President Trump or Biden. And, it's the kind of practice that really should not be appropriate. It's one of these things that allows for improprieties. I'm trying to be careful here because we're live on YouTube. So I want to measure my words. But what I would suggest is that this is not only a major victory for states' rights, but it's also a victory toward the many states, particularly the so-called battleground states, that are in the process of cleaning up their voter rolls and improving their voter integrity in light of the last election, which, again, I want to be careful here, but let's just say that it was seen as a disaster when it comes to voter safety. And I want to mention this delicately when I point out that there are now, I believe, 6 or 7 audits being conducted in states where state legislators believe that they have evidence that there were improprieties during the last election. The most famous and the biggest one is being done in Maricopa County, Arizona. This is all news. I'm not saying anything that isn't being reported by the mainstream press here. So any of you YouTube censorers, just know that. And I'm not talking about specifics. I would say that particular audit is a gold standard of audits. It was fantastic. Anyone who followed it, they had cameras all over the place. Everything was completely transparent, as the saying goes. You could see everything going on. They had these kind of carousels where every vote was checked by 3 different people. It would go around the table like a lazy Susan. They would roll it around the table. None of whom could speak to each other, all of whom were nonpartisan or of different parties. They were observers. Everything was done so excellently that it should be an audit that serves as an example going forward. I would suggest that all 50 states should have this audit, including my own state of Massachusetts. I would also suggest that this type of audit take place in every election going forward. There also are thousands of lawsuits that are continuing to move their way slowly through the courts. There are thousands of affidavits by citizens who witnessed voter impropriety in the last election, none of which, interestingly, are being really researched or read by media. You'd think the media would look at this, would do stories on it. Nothing. You hear nothing discussed, probably because they're afraid, like I'm afraid right now, of being pulled out and sent off into Siberia. There's a huge censorship going on now from big tech and from big media on this issue. And again, I'm not mentioning the issue specifically. There was a lot of money that poured into the campaign last time from big tech. I'm not mentioning any names in particular, but there's one figure in particular who is the CEO of one of the major big tech companies, who spent out of his own pocket and that of his wife something like $400 million, which went to secretaries of states and local organizations through third parties in the so-called battleground states to try to create, allegedly, certain outcomes. Let's put it that way. We don't know exactly who got the money. We know a couple of these secretaries of states who got the money, such as Raffensperger in Georgia and Hobbs in Arizona. That's public record. But we don't know exactly who got the money on the street. Let's put it that way. And it was very corrupting. Not to mention this multi-billionaire whose last name is similar to the Yiddish word Soros, who has financed a lot of sort of third-party groups around the country who got involved, let's just say, in electoral politics. I'm trying to be careful here. I just really right now want to test out the system. So I'm going to give out the number if anybody would like to call in. And if you do call in, again, let's remember that we're on YouTube here, so we have to be very, very careful. These are subjects that get into subjects that are forbidden. 617-396-4958 is the number. 617-396-4958. If you want to call in, you will go on the air with me and you'll be heard. And we will have a conversation just like as if this is an old-fashioned radio program. So you're welcome to join me. So I consider the Supreme Court decision today a major step toward reasserting the rights of the sovereign states to regulate their elections. Article 3 of the Constitution says that state legislators, by the way, not even state governors, certainly not state secretaries of state, who are charged with administering election laws in the states, but not making election laws. Not judges, not justices, not bureaucrats, no third parties, but only state legislators are in charge of making election laws in their respective states. No one else. And the Supreme Court essentially has upheld that principle by recognizing the state legislature in Arizona as having the right to ban the practice of voter harvesting, which is an excellent development for those of us who care about sovereignty and freedom and control over our own politics. Now, the mainstream media has, and the left and the internationalists and the whole crowd that was, I would suggest, involved in some of the improprieties during the last election, let's put it that way, that they are trying to craft this thing as, or any such laws, as being motivated by having something against African American men and women, that these laws are meant to suppress the votes of African American men and women, which is a lie. In fact, I would suggest quite the opposite is the truth. If our states don't put in good, solid voter rules and allow for things like voter harvesting, and ban things like ID, and allow for non-voters' names to remain on voter rolls, people who have passed on or who have moved out of the state, then what they're doing is they're opening the door for an artificial vote to be cast, a fake vote. And that is suppressing votes, nothing else. A vote is suppressed. Your vote is suppressed when a false vote is cast. Every time a false vote is cast, a real vote is suppressed. So these laws are meant to reduce and prevent voter suppression. And the idea of framing this in the context of race is really, really despicable, because what they're saying is that somehow African Americans are not able to, get ID or vote normally like everyone else, and it's an insulting kind of racism. It's sort of like the white man's burden, Rudyard Kipling racism, as if somehow African Americans are to be treated like children. They can't do these things themselves. That's bullcrap. I'm sorry, but the people that are crafting these laws don't give a damn about Black people. They care about keeping in place a mechanism by which they can cheat. That's quite clear to me. And that states need to take back this sovereign ability to make election law that protect the system of one man, one vote, and end this continuous voter fraud. This is something that, people make jokes about this. Remember like Kennedy, right? I think that it was confirmed probably 10 years later, maybe 15 years later.
It really bothers me that he's a pack for communist China.
The election was questionable in 1960. And I think that some reporters and journalists investigated, particularly Chicago and Mayor Daley and that system, and they discovered that the rumors that 30,000 people had voted from the grave were pretty much true, and it has pretty much been confirmed. Look, I think John F. Kennedy was a great man and a great president. And I'm frankly happy that he was elected. But that doesn't in any way negate the fact that it has been confirmed that it was a stolen election. And that, it took, as I said, it took 10 years to get there. There's a difference between then and now, in that claims now made, even if you believe they were false, and I'm not commenting either way here, I'm not condemning, I'm not condoning. All I'll note is that John F. Kennedy, that first of all, Kennedy was probably more conservative than Nixon. And then Nixon he didn't have a movement. He was kind of a Me Too Republican, just sort of get along to go along. There was not a lot of difference between those two. Whereas the accusations today, there is a major difference, and there is a major movement that expressed itself on Election Day with 71 million voters, and that there are policy differences now that are significant and that affect our lives. There was a set of particulars, what we might call an agenda, around the election of our last president, Donald Trump. It was, in a euphemism, it was the America First agenda. And there were people who wanted to stop that agenda, I would suggest, who don't believe that we should put our nation first. They believe in internationalism. They think borders are somehow an anachronism and are old-fashioned, and that are a form of prejudice. And, Donald Trump was both a political and an economic nationalist. He was a political nationalist in that he wanted to assert America's sovereign rights to control its borders, and he did it, and did it quite effectively, I may add. And he was an economic nationalist in that he wanted to put American industry, American labor, American wages first by putting tariffs on nations like China that were involved with dumping cheap products into the United States. And by the way, China, Germany, Japan, Britain, they have tariffs on American goods. So he was basically balancing the books by putting likewise tariffs on those imports and protecting American industry and labor, economic nationalism, preserving the domestic industry and the domestic labor. These policies are very much different from the sort of ruling class, oligarchic, internationalist, utopian-oriented policies that had existed before Trump is certain in power and that exist now in this country. So you had a genuine contrast, which is why any questions about the election now are different than the questions that were raised in 1960. There is a difference. There is a different understanding of how we want our nation to move forward. Now, I'm not commenting on whether or not I think anything untold might have happened. All I'm saying here is that I hope that the various processes and legal mechanisms move forward appropriately, and they are. There are audits now in 6 states, with Maricopa County being the big one. Others include Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and New Hampshire. There are lawsuits, there are affidavits, there is an ongoing discovery and awareness that we need to have our election really researched. Now, I'm not saying anything happened. I don't want to get taken down on YouTube because I know it's forbidden, which itself is interesting. I'm simply saying let the system work its way through, because we still have, I believe, and maybe I'm naive here, but we still have a government of laws and not men. We still have a constitutional system, and we still have the means to exercise those rights and those abilities as citizens. So that's all I'm saying about it. I'm not going to say more. I will also just note again, according to today's Boston Globe, my own paper, that the Supreme Court has decided in favor of the right of Arizona, and as such of the right of all of the states, to make their own election laws and to protect the voters in those states as they see fit. And the people of those states, by the way, if the people of Arizona, the people of any state, they believe in something like voter harvesting, fine. Let the state legislator put forth a voter harvesting law and say, let's have voter harvesting, and then it will be the proper mechanism is for that to be voted on at the State House. And if that passes and it's signed into law by the governor, that's the right of that state. That's all. This is a simple state right issue. And finally, those situations are moving in the right direction. Another recent example was that in Michigan, the Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, was changing election laws to say that absentee ballots did not have to get signature verification. You could just guess, or you could look at the squiggle on a line and declare it. In other words, she lowered the standards that had been put in place by the Michigan State Legislature, which again is the sole authority to making law. Well, that's been overturned by a judge in Michigan. Of course, it's too late to have affected the last election, so we'll never know if it really impacted it one way or the other. I only bring it up to note that she was not acting within the laws of that state, according to this judge and according to the U.S. Constitution, and that's been rectified. So these are all moves that are in the right direction. in terms of the people, the citizens reasserting their right to regulate their own state elections. And we should remember that all elections in this country are state elections. When you have a federal election for president, that is technically 50 state elections that happen on the same day. So I'm going to leave it at that. I want to thank you for joining me. Charles Moskowitz. My books are available at Amazon Books if you want to check them out. My latest book, The Satanic Conspiracy, is actually doing pretty well. You know, I'm getting some interest on that. So you're welcome to check it out on Amazon Books. And I want to thank you all for joining me this afternoon.